think the matchup to watch is Riley Moss versus Smith-NJIGBA. Because I'll be frank, and this is going to sound like I'm hating all over Iowa. I don't think Moss can guard him. All right? I hope he proves me wrong. I really do. Because here's the deal. Riley Moss was a defensive back of the year last year. We saw him get beat against Kent State. We saw him get beat on some double moves early. I don't think teams really tested him real well as the season went on. He had some inflated perception because of interceptions, and I give him credit for those. I'm not saying he's a really good defensive back. I'm not saying he's not, but we saw something out of Smith-NJIGBA in the Rose Bowl that I think is going to be hard for any Big Ten team to cover. And I just wonder, with C.J. Stroud's ability to throw in the pocket, and certainly Barrett had the ability as well. And I mean, it's not like they didn't, they ran up and down the field with Iowa early in that game, and once they got behind, it kind of snowballed. But I think that's the matchup to watch: Smith-NJIGBA versus Riley Moss.
It's going to be very interesting to see from an Ohio State perspective what they do with Smith-NJIGBA this year. You lose Chris Olave, you lose Garrett Wilson, who were your two outside receivers last year. We saw in the Rose Bowl Smith-NJIGBA move around quite a bit, so he wasn't just playing the slot position. And they say they're going to do that with a lot of these guys. We'll see how much that is a thing. If Jackson's really going to end up playing on the outside a lot more, it could even be a matchup thing. You move him around based on who you're playing and whatnot. But I mean, you're spot on. I mean, there's a reason he's been talked about as arguably the best wide receiver in the country. I mean, certainly the way he ended, as you said, the Rose Bowl game, but he had 2 games last year with 15 receptions. I mean, that both set Ohio State records, and that obviously tied it, 347 yards in the Rose Bowl. Now, I will say Utah's secondary was very beat up. They were playing a guy who mostly played running back at cornerback. So there were some things that Ohio State certainly took advantage of, but you still put up 347 yards and 3 touchdowns. And then obviously, there's other guys to match up with in Ohio State's wide receiver room. I mean, Marvin Harrison Jr., son of the Hall of Famer, caught 3 touchdowns in the Rose Bowl in his first start too. So I think Ohio State's receiving core is going to be a problem regardless of who they play this year. It's just, I mean, assuming these guys actually live up to what they're expected to be, but it looks like they will. I think you've just got to figure out other ways to slow Ohio State down. Can you shut down the running game and make them one-dimensional? Teams weren't able to do that at times. They were able to stop them in short yardage situations, which is what Michigan did so well against Ohio State's offense, last year. They've worked on this offensive line to try and get it better in those situations. So we'll wait and see how much better that is. But I mean, this was the number 1 offense in the country. And I think if you ask people within the Woody Hayes Athletic Center in Columbus, they would tell you that they think this offense is going to be better than last year's, which is crazy to say for sure.
Yeah, I think I just sold myself a little bit. I think a lot of Iowa fans did when you just said that, of it better than last year's offense. And I think Ohio State's offense last year, we're talking historically good, as you know. So basically what I'm gathering from what you're talking about with Smith-NJIGBA is we may not see a lot of Moss versus Smith-NJIGBA. We may see, because Iowa doesn't like to switch. Iowa's not going to be moving Moss all over the field.
Yeah, I mean, I think it will depend, on how things go early in the year. If they need to use him as a slot receiver, if that's where he's the best, I think that's where they'll put him. I just know that they've worked with him to move him to the outside at times, and maybe that would even become a full-time thing. They have Emeka Egbuka, who is the number 1 receiver 2 years ago, who was kind of projected as a slot receiver, though wide receiver coach Brian Hartline has said this offseason that he doesn't know if that's a really accurate depiction of how they'll use him. So it's going to be interesting to see once they get out there. We hoped that the spring game would provide a little clarity, but with the way they broke down kind of the offense and defense, guys were moving all over the place anyway. So it'll certainly be interesting. I would say that last year going into the season, I knew, okay, you had Chris Olave and Garrett Wilson on the outside. We didn't know what JAXON Smith-NJIGBA was going to be, but we knew where he would play. This year, it's a little bit more up in the air. You do have Marvin Harrison Jr. and Julian Fleming, who I think are pretty clearly outside guys. But then what they do with JAXON Smith-NJIGBA and Emeka Egbuka will be interesting to see. And like I said, I think it will depend on kind of what works earlier on in the year. And then if everything's working, then you can kind of play the matchups.
The one thing I do wonder, like, this becomes a bit of a game of chess as we continue with the Purdue struggles. I mean, year after year, Iowa continuing to struggle to defend Purdue. And great as Iowa, that's what's like, to me, it makes it easy for teams like Ohio State to be like, okay, we just got to look at what Purdue's doing because we got the talent, we got the speed. Like, what are they doing to expose Iowa? And so they've been doing it. But again, to do it last year with one of the better defenses Iowa's had, I mean, Purdue exposed Iowa again. Now, I'd like to think, if I'm in a game of chess, I'd like to think that Phil Parker is going to be making some adjustments because he didn't make adjustments during the game last year, not nearly enough, and not that I could see, my eyes could see. I just wonder, like Ryan Day, how much, everybody talks about how great of a mind he is. At what point does he utilize what Jeff Brom has had success doing? And, if that's the case, then Phil Parker is going to have to counter, and we have an entire offseason. I'd like to think, I know Ohio State's got bigger fish to fry, but I still, and the other Ohio State guys we talked with on the Ohio State channel, don't think this is a game that necessarily is, on the bulletin board. But I think you bring up the 2017 game if you're Ohio State. I think it does you no harm in bringing it up. If you're going to struggle to find motivation, like if you line up Michigan, Michigan State, Penn State, Iowa, like Iowa's probably in fourth place from a player perception, right? As far as importance. And that would probably be the one game of those four that you may fear your guys not getting up for. Is that fair to say? Like, you're not going to struggle to get up for Michigan State, Penn State, and Michigan.
Right. Well, and I think what makes this game that much more interesting is it comes right in between Ohio State playing at Michigan State and at Penn State. So to your point, if you're not up for this game, you're looking ahead. You come off a tough game probably against Michigan State on the road. That game's in October, so it won't be the cold, snowy East Lansing that we've seen from time to time, but still, I imagine a tough game. And then you have Iowa, and if you're looking ahead to Penn State and going to Happy Valley, all of a sudden you're in a dogfight in the fourth quarter at Ohio Stadium in a game that you didn't expect to be. And so I think, that's certainly something. And I've mentioned this a couple times on things I've been on. There are a few stretches, one in Ohio State's schedule where, the Buckeyes can't buy into the hype, especially if they go out and beat Notre Dame week 1 and then they beat Wisconsin week 4. This team, while more experienced than last year's team, they haven't done anything yet. I mean, they won a Rose Bowl. They didn't win a Big Ten. This isn't the Buckeye teams that have kind of rolled the 4 years prior. So you've still got to go out and you have a lot to prove this year. And that means taking each week, 1 week at a time. And, I don't think you can just expect to roll over Big Ten teams. Now, sometimes it happens for Ohio State and you get years like 2019 when it didn't matter what the numbers were next to that team until they ran into Clemson in the playoff. And even that game was tight. But that's not every year. I know the perception of Ohio State is they've been the juggernaut of the Big Ten, but this loss that we've been talking about, the Purdue loss in Urban Meyer's last year, I mean, there's been games like that, and there's been closer. Ohio State could have lost to Indiana at home in the 2020 season, and then things are really different. It was a 7-point game. So, you have to take these games seriously. And another thing with Iowa, looking at Iowa's offense, and if they're just going to be willing to run it at Ohio State. This is a defensive scheme that, from what we understand with Jim Knowles taking over, coming from the Big 12 and Oklahoma State, is set to play with 2 linebackers and against spread attacks more often than not. I've pointed to the Wisconsin game in week 4 as a big test for this defense. They do have some change ups to be able to handle teams that want to run those more traditional looks like Wisconsin and like Iowa certainly can. But if say Wisconsin has some success against Ohio State doing that type of stuff, bringing in a fullback and whatnot, Iowa, I think, could then take some of that, whether they beat the Buckeyes or not, take some of that and say, okay, this is where Jim Knowles' defense may be susceptible. And so I think that could be an interesting, matchup as we get towards that game as well.